ישויות. דורקהיים, זה הדבר הראשון. אחר כך זה המרכז לסוציולוגיה תרבותית, ואני ממש מתרגשת שקם דבר כזה, לדעתי יש לזה חשיבות עצומה במרחב הישראלי, וכמו שאמרתי היום בארוחת צהריים, אני נורא מצטערת שזה לא קם לפני 20 שנה. אני הרבה זמן פעלתי פה עם תחושה של יתמות קצת מוסדית ואינטלקטואלית, ואני חושבת שהמרכז כזה יכול בהחלט להוות בית. לבסוף אני פה גם אולי רק בעיקר לכבד את אילנה סילבר. האמת היא שמכל שלושת הדברים האלה אני הכי מתרגשת מלכבד את אילנה סילבר, ואני חושבת שכולנו חוקרים דברים שמעסיקים אותנו, מייצגים אותנו איכשהו. אנחנו אף פעם לא יכולים לנתק לגמרי את המחקר שלנו ממי שאנחנו, ולא במקרה אילנה חוקרת פילנתרופיה ומתנה, כי כשאני חושבת עליה איזה סוג של אדם היא פשוט כולה מתנה. וגם לא כל המתנות דומות אחת לשנייה, והייתי אומרת על אילנה שהיא סוג של מתנה שופעת קודם כל, והיא נותנת את עצמה לשם הדבר עצמו, לשם עצמה, זה מתנה טהורה, pure gift. תודה על החברות שלך, ותודה על התרומה האדירה שלך בסוציולוגיה הישראלית. טוב, Anthony Trollope 1884 novel An All Man's Love offers a powerful literary illustration of the ways in which in the 19th century emotions were aligned with the social norm of matrimony. The author tells the story of the young Mary Laurie, an orphan who has been taken to live in the household of old Mr. Whittlestaff. Because Mr. Whittlestaff has never been married, Mary anticipates the decision she will have to make when he proposes. Nothing has been said yet. She muses about her prospective decision. She told herself that he personally was full of good gifts. How different might it have been with her had some elderly man wanted her, such as she had seen about in the world. How much was there in this man that she knew that she could learn to love? And he was one of whom she need in no ways be ashamed. He was a gentleman, pleasant to look at, sweet in manner, comely and clean in appearance. Would not the world say of her how lucky she had been, should it come to pass that she should become Mrs. Whittlestaff? After an hour's deliberation, she thought that she would marry Mr. Whittlestaff. These reflections are not formulated as an interrogation about her or Mr. Whittlestaff's feelings. In fact, Mary knows he will propose, although nothing explicit has been said. Her decision to such presumed proposal is also clear. In a matter of 1 hour, Mary has settled with herself her matrimonial future by invoking and rehearsing mentally a set of arguments for accepting Whittlestaff's proposal. And these arguments have much to do with his virtues and what she imagines the world would say should she become his wife. She sees in him the same virtues which the world will see in him, thus suggesting an overlap between private and collective judgment. Her own and the world's evaluation of Whittlestaff are shaped by known social scripts of the good man, by norms of matrimony, and by conventions of the proper role of a woman, because her evaluation of him and her affection for him are grounded in common and known standards. Her feelings and her decision incorporate all in one her sentiments, the economic advantage of a marriage, and the social expectations of a woman in her situation. It's a very particular kind of choice, in other words. Feelings and norms form a single cultural matrix and shape directly her decision making. However confused Mary's feelings in the novel will later turn out to be, she knows, and all the characters know, the terms of her hesitation. This is a world where everybody shares the same normative information about how the personal and the normative should be ordered. Emil Durkheim may be credited for being one of the first, or the first, to have grasped what the collapse of such emotional normative and institutional order was about. Unfrequently noticed by sociologists is the extent to which Durkheim's notion of anomie, in his much famed and now canonical sociological study on suicide, sociologists have not noticed how much this book refers also to sexual and matrimonial desire. In extraordinary words, Durkheim describes the emotional structure of a new social type that had appeared in French society in the 19th century. And this new social type is the single man. Though the married man's enjoyment is restricted, it is assured, and this certainty forms his mental foundation. The lot of the unmarried man is different, as he has the right to form attachment wherever inclination leads him. He aspires to everything and is satisfied with nothing. This morbid desire for the infinite, which everywhere accompanies anomie, may as readily assail this as any other part of our consciousness. It very often assumes a sexual form, which was described by Musset, a French poet. When one is no longer checked, one becomes unable to check one's self. Beyond experienced pleasures, one senses and desires others. If one happens almost to have exhausted the range of what is possible, one dreams of the impossible. One thirsts for the non-existent. How can the feelings not be exacerbated by such unending pursuit? For them to reach that state, one need not even have infinitely multiplied the experiences of love and lived the life of a Don Juan. The humdrum existence of the ordinary bachelor suffices. New hopes constantly awake, only to be deceived, leaving a trail of weariness and disillusionment behind them. How can desire then become fixed, being uncertain that it can retain what it attracts? For the anomie is twofold. Just as the person makes no definitive gift of himself, he has no definitive title to nothing. The uncertainty of the future plus his own indeterminateness therefore condemn him to constant change. The result of it all is a state of disturbance, agitation, and discontent which inevitably increases the possibilities of suicide. End of quote. Durkheim here offers an extraordinary program for what we may call a sociology of desire and a sociology of emotional decision-making. Some desires translate into direct decision-making, marriage, marry Laurie, and some don't. The single man's desire is anomic because it undermines the capacity to will an object with a definite purpose. Anomic desire is neither depressive nor apathetic. It is on the contrary restless, hyperactive, in perpetual quest of something. It is a desire which cannot enter marriage because it cannot create the psychic conditions to want a single object. It is a desire that properly lacks an object and which, in lacking an object, is insatiable. This creates a particular form of action, one that is at once in perpetual motion and lacks an overarching purpose. According to Durkheim, then, anomic desire has a number of characteristics. One is that it lacks a teleology, that is, it doesn't have a purpose. It is free-floating and free-circulating. 2, because it does not have a teleology, it also is devoid of an internal normative peg around which one could build an overarching narrative structure. 3, anomic desire lacks a sense of inner ordering and hierarchy because anomic desires exist on a plane of horizontal equivalence. If they are not organized by a hierarchized normative and teleological cosmos, as in Trollope's story, their objects become indistinguishable in their worth. 4, for the single man, the future is uncertain, and cannot provide guidance for the present. The married man, on the other hand, has a known and certain future based on normative knowledge and participation. He knows which pleasures are waiting for him, and through the very institution of marriage is assured of their continued possession. In contrast, the single man cannot imagine the future and is locked in a present which contains only hopefulness, espérance, a far more vague and amorphous sentiment than one's projection in the future. And finally, in anomic desire, the subject's inner life, what Durkheim calls the mental plate, l'assiette mentale, becomes indeterminate, moving from one object to the next, and thus acts in a state of uncertainty, unable to make a decision because unable to fixate desire on a person and an institution, what Durkheim calls indeterminateness. The married man is the one who has by definition made a decision, while the single man can only accumulate indefinitely experiences, desires, and partners without being able to bring the perpetual motion of his desire to an emotional and narrative closure. So uncertainty, accumulation, motion, inability to imagine the future, all of these constitute the essence of what Durkheim views as anomic desire, unable to appropriate social norms and to identify with institutions. Durkheim offers here the grounds for a sociology of desire and emotional decision-making, and helps articulate two grammars of social bond and emotional choice, one in which desire is free-floating, lacking in finality, and originating in subjectivity, and one in which desire is organized through the fusion of economic interests, norms of matrimony, and gender roles. One is organized around certainty, and the other one around uncertainty. And the remainder of this paper is devoted to exploring these two grammars. The disappearance of courtship is a rather striking phenomenon of modern romantic practices and marks a stark difference between traditional and contemporary romantic practices. Therefore, it deserves a more insistent scrutiny than has been provided so far by sociologists of sexuality and marriage. Mazé? Wow. I want to examine, therefore, traditional courtship, and I want to draw, as I said, a comparison between two grammars of social bonds and desire. And in doing this, I will simplify, of course, a great deal of the actual description of traditional practices of courtship, and I will draw a too sharp contrast between the traditional and the contemporary. I mean, I'm completely aware of the limitations of the strategy because it does not capture the range of behaviors which make the past similar to the present, and it fails to grasp the ways in which the past still lives in and structures the present. I'm aware of these limitations, and yet I'm nonetheless confident that it actually adequately accounts for the nature of the shift undergone by courtship practices, that is, the changes in the rules and modes of engagement of emotional subject entering social interactions. I would define courtship as a structured social framework for decision-making where the decision was either emotional, practical, or both. Courtship is thus a cultural technique to make a decision by providing procedures in which the interiority fixated itself and gelled around known rules. As a social form, pre-modern courtship or traditional courtship produced certainty not in the sense that it guaranteed the outcome, although it did help secure the outcome, but in the double sense that, on the one hand, it did not make the future into a problem, because the purpose of the courtship is known and accepted by all parties, and also in that it relied on a clear set of rules which organized emotions and interactions into known cultural pathways. So when I refer here to certainty and uncertainty, I really draw on the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, who has made certainty into a central feature of interactions. In his view, the reduction of complexity and the reduction of uncertainty are fundamental components of social processes. And he says that love, along with truth, money, and power, is what he calls a medium of communication. That is, it helps create expectations, select one decisions among many, connect motivation to action, create certainty and predictability in relationships. I would like thus to define certainty as, and I quote, referring to a person's ability to describe, predict, and explain behavior within social situations, or conversely, as defined by the Blackwell Encyclopedia of Sociology, uncertainty is unclear, ambiguous, or contradictory cognitive constructions which cause feelings of uncertainty. It's a bit tautological, but it's okay. Not only ritual, but also normative clarity, knowing what the norm and the rule are, generate certainty about definitions of situation. So certainty is a psychic attribute of persons, but it is also an attribute of interactions. Therefore, I want to ask, what are the components of such interaction in the context of courtship? In other words, I'm saying that what we call emotional certainty is actually produced by a number of sociological features. First, normative certainty. Normative certainty pertains to the perceived clarity of norms and values present in an interaction. The easier it is to identify, consciously or not, the norms present in an interaction, the more forceful the norms are and the more predictable that interaction is. For example, going out fully clad is far more predictable than buying flowers on a third date. The protection of women's virginity remained one of the most fundamental norms at the center of traditional courtship until well into the 20th century. Women had to protect their sexual purity, and men were held responsible for deviations from sexual codes of conduct, if they happened. 2, existential certainty. This is, by the way, my own way of developing Durkheim. If I want to take his program about anomic desire further. So I consider this part to be a kind of development of Durkheim thought. Existential certainty. Normative certainty yields what I would call existential certainty, that is, the perceived fit between one's subjective and objective social experience. Existential certainty enables one to answer easily the question, who am I in this situation and who is the other to me? As a result, it is easy to respond to the question, what do I owe this person in this situation? Gender divisions and distinctions and hierarchies were crucial aspects of that system in the predictability of courtship, of the courtship system. Courtship was geared to an object, a woman, who had to decide to reciprocate an emotion or an action initiated always by a man, and in that respect, it was structured by a very clear division of gender roles. As Jane Austen put it in her novel Northanger Abbey, in the mouth of Henry Tilney, man has the advantage of choice, women only the power of refusal. Existential certainty derives from the fact that we identify the frame of meaning of an interaction and know our place and role in it. It accrues to interactions in which class and gender boundaries are clear and relatively non-negotiable, thus creating a sense of place, what Goffman would call a sense of place. 3, ontological certainty. The third mechanism creating certainty in courtship lied in the objectivation of feelings through the material world of tokens and gifts. Despite their legendary force, emotions are plagued by the fact that they are shifting and volatile. In pre-modern or traditional courtship, the exchange of gifts and tokens of various values marked and sealed the intention of each of the partners. Gifts mattered not as an expression of interiority, but for their capacity to bind intention and feelings, to commit them. As historian John Gillis remarks, the intention of the giver of a gift had much to do with whether a gift had binding powers. That is, an object played an important role in objectifying relationships, that is, in marking their progression and pacing them, indicating their beginning, their progression, and their commitment. You didn't give the same thing at different stages in the relationship. For example, there was a custom in Britain to break a 3-penny coin and to keep each part as a token of commitment. If the courtship was interrupted, each had to bring back the piece. In other words, feelings were organized in a tangible and material framework that required an ontological objectivity that derived from the fact that the relationship was translated into objects, making sentiments objective, so to speak. Gillis furthermore suggests that in order to determine if someone was a casual seducer or a serious suitor, there was an extensive use of intermediaries as witnesses to the words and actions of another, a system, again, of fixation and inscription of promises, intentions, words, and feelings in objects and in persons, that is, witnesses which took sentiments out of the interiority of subjects and placed them in the public and visible world. An objectified system of gift exchange and witnesses established the relationship performatively rather than through the subjective introspection and emotional expression. Evaluative certainty is the fourth characteristic. It is the capacity to gather reliable information about others and to know how to evaluate them according to established standards and criteria of evaluation. In traditional courtship, this task was achieved by the fact that prospective partners belonged to closed social networks. As Richard Belcroft put it, a historian, partners either came from the same village or town or knew each other through the sharing of a common residence during employment. Most couples knew each other very well before marriage through religious and community group affiliations, and many marriages occurred among servants and apprentices in the same household, end of quote. So most people knew quite well the person they were married from the village or the town or by reputation. That mode of information gathering made evaluation into a collective act, with reputation playing an important role in mate selection. This mode of information gathering was not, of course, more reliable than ours, say, but it did create the sense that one had externalized and objective ways to know who the other person was. Procedural certainty pertains to the rules in which one is able to carry forward an interaction. Rules differ from norms in that they pertain to the sequential order in which things are done and to the capacity to carry forward an interaction according to a certain plan. For example, in middle-class homes, the widespread 19th century practice of calling observed a protocol whereby a suitor would submit his desire to court a woman for her parents' approval and would be subsequently admitted. Rules and procedures moved along with the fact that the courtship had a narrative structure. And by the way, I think that if the novel in the 18th century contained so many stories of courtship, it's not because the courtship imitated the novel, but rather the reverse. The novel imitated the narrative structure of the courtship. Courtship was an experience of going through different stages or sequences. This is why the emotional exchange was likely to follow a narrative progression. One moved step by step with a sense of direction, and the direction and of the interaction gave certainty to its meaning and to the part each one was supposed to play. As Richard Belcroft again put it, there existed a well-established sequence of events leading up to marriage, including the announcement of banns to solicit community comment and input. The narrativity or sequentiality of courtship were made thus possible by the fact that social interactions and emotions were enmeshed with religious cultural cosmologies which consecrated the emotion of love and sexuality in the sacraments of marriage. The last dimension of certainty conveyed by traditional forms of courtship pertains to the fact that actors acted as if they knew the nature and intensity of their emotions and those of others. Emotional certainty is tightly connected to the capacity to translate emotions into sequences, narratives, goals, and objectify signs which express and induce performatively emotions. But one characteristic of courtship was that emotions were very often declared at the beginning of the courtship. And once declared, they followed a course known in advance by all parties, a fact which made the declaration of feelings into a crucial moment. For example, Calvin Lindley Rohn courted an African-American school teacher in Brenham, Texas, named Lucia Knotts. His courtship took the form which many courtship took, in starting as the confession of an emotion or as a revelation. So on May 31st, 1886, Calvin wrote to Lucia a letter which would start, this is the first letter, it would start a 19-month courtship and subsequent decision to marry. His letter started like this: "Do you ever think of me? Miss Lucia, it is unnecessary to say, I love you with all my heart." This is, end of quote. This is the first interaction. In many cases, 19th century courtship, love was declared at the outset and was the starting rather than the end point of an interaction. Declaring love at the beginning of courtship thus neutralized emotional uncertainty. More, emotional certainty was often the condition under which a woman accepted to interact with a man. By declaring himself, the man increased his chances to win the heart of the beloved. So the many forms of certainty described above derive from a crucial sociological characteristic of courtship, namely the fact that it had the structure of ritual, another crucial concept of Durkheim's theory, which resonates on the mode of opposition with anomie. I think that for Durkheim, ritual was, if you want conceptually, the response. He started his work with anomie, with the notion of anomie, and later developed this notion of ritual. And I think one is actually, there's an internal cohesion in his work, because I think ritual is the response to anomie. Ritual is the sociological and conceptual response to anomie, and rituals are not, in Durkheim, are not about cognitions or representations. Rather, they create a dynamic field of energy that bind actors together through the enactment of shared rules and through the shared participation in a hot symbolic reality. Rituals, like norms, define the intensity, the boundaries, and the object of emotions. This is because, as Durkheim made clear, rituals reduce uncertainty and ambiguity. Social reality always threatens to lose its order, to let chaos and unpredictability enter consciousness. Rituals are precisely the device to offset the threat of chaos. As Cambridge anthropologist Joel Robbins puts it very insightfully, rituals bring, I quote, clarity, certainty, trustworthiness, and orthodoxy on the information it conveys. End of quote. Rituals bring people together through predictable and shared rules, which intensify and sharpen emotions, reduce self-awareness, and increase the capacity to believe in the reality of the situation. Because ritual is a structured behavior, it directs attention to the object of the interaction rather than to the inner self. This is the reason why other anthropologist Douglas Marshall suggests that actors who engage in ritual experience, I find this idea extremely interesting. He says, actors who engage in ritual experience their own will. When attention is focused on some eternal object, it is the emotional relation to the object that occupies the center of consciousness. Inversely, if you want, introspection or the lack of ritual invites introspection, and in introspection, the self-centered attention becomes, if you want, emotionally more uncertain because it does not trod the well-known normative and procedural path of rituals. To sum up, traditional courtship was organized within a to sum up, I am not finishing though, just, I don't want to give you hope. Premodern courtship was organized within a semiotic social normative framework which created cultural pathways for emotions to be organized teleologically and narratively through shared norms and rules. These pathways, to be sure, were based on gender inequality, on the equation of sexuality with sinfulness, on heteronormativity enshrined in law, and on the centrality of marriage for economic status and moral reputation. This form of certainty cannot be separated in any way from religious patriarchy, from gender inequalities, and from the equation of sex with sinfulness. It was in fact directly produced by them, probably. This moral and cultural frame became contested and transformed in the aftermath of the vast cultural and social changes after the late 1960s, what is commonly referred to as the sexual revolution. Throughout the 20th century, sexuality underwent major cultural shifts, which led to a deep transformation of sexual interactions, making them bear the characteristics of what Durkheim had described as anomic desire. The history of sexuality is well known, and I'll just say very quickly that throughout the 20th century, sexuality became very much privatized and made into the prerogative of the individual through all kinds of legal decisions. It was scientized through biological views of the body, and thus it was snatched away from religious morality. And finally, the sexual body was converted into a hedonic unit through Freudianism and through consumer culture. And all of these, if you want, entailed four major transformation of sexuality. I mean, I speak about this at great length. I can't do it here, obviously, but just to say it very quickly, it entailed four major transformations of sexuality. One, what I call the immanence of the sexual body that was recuperated by the consumer market. Immanence of the sexual body, I mean that the body does not refer anymore, the sexuality refers no longer to any theology, it does not refer to kinship, it's simply self-referential, and it is biological also. Two is the formation of a category of experience based on the accumulation of sexual experiences, with age of marriage becoming postponed, and most people who marry today have already accumulated a number of sexual partners. The splintering of the heterosexual encounter in different possible paths, that is, it can be matrimonial, it can be emotional, it can be sexual. So that splintering, the institutionalization of different normative orders and logic of action is very important. And finally, the shift to a procedural ethics based on consent, which is very important. These changes have had an overwhelming effect to free the sexual and romantic terrain from what might be called thick normativity by introducing a thin procedural one, which is why consent has become so important. Thick normativity contains elaborate stories and prescriptions that define actions in terms of good and bad, immoral and moral, pure and impure, shameful and commendable, virtuous and vile, and thus connects human behavior to cultural cosmologies and to collective stories such as that of the original sin, etc. And they contain definite conceptions of the good and the bad and the moral and the immoral. Thin procedural morality, on the other hand, gives individuals the right to decide about the moral content of their preferences and focuses solely, almost, on the rules and procedures to secure respect for the psychic and bodily autonomy of the individual. It is thus relatively silent, if you want, on the moral valence of actions and evaluates them in reference to the degree to which they respect the subject's autonomy and capacity to experience pleasure. All these transformations have made sexual relationships into a realm saturated with uncertainty. Most obvious in the practice of casual sex. For anyone who knows the United States, you know how much has been written endlessly about the practice, for example, of casual sex and hookup culture in universities. Casual sex, I think, is, again, a sociological form we should really pay close attention to. It differs from traditional sociability, conventionally based on mutuality, narrativity, expectations, and projections on the future. It also differs from interactions with strangers where non-mutuality is expected and scripted, expected and non-negotiable. When you go to a store, you know, so this kind of, it's an interaction between strangers, but it is scripted and it is expected like that. So I wouldn't say it's uncertain. Casual sex happens most often between people who are complete strangers to each other. In fact, one of the codes of casual sex is not to know the name of the person you are having sex with. Casual sex is an uncertain form of interaction because it admits a wide spectrum of possibilities upon entering the interaction, about the definition of the frame and about the goal of the interaction. For sociologists and economists, uncertainty is precisely about expectations, and more exactly about the very difficulty in producing, imagining, and negotiating expectations, which is exactly what casual sex exemplifies. So I quote here an economist who says, uncertainty refers to the future and to whether our expectations will be met, and also to the present and our capacity to produce expectations. He says, typically norms and institutions structure our expectations. They support clear and unambiguous notions and expectations, even though they are always to a degree uncertain. So while in traditional bourgeois courtship gender roles were ultimately subsumed under the definition of marriage and morality, the emergence of casual sex as a form that emerges directly from consumer culture and from political movements of emancipation and liberation actually, I think, is, I would say that casual sex is what I would call a social script in reverse. It is a script for a non-relationship. Let me provide you one among many, many examples I have in my book. It's a popular romance novel called The Big Love, in which the heroine Allison has 2 prolonged sexual encounters with her boss, Henry. After these encounters, Allison enters Henry's office and makes the following inquiry. So she starts, and they're having a dialogue. I was wondering if we could talk about our relationship. Relationship, Henry said, still busy with the papers. What relationship? Well, you know, I said this. Henry looked up from his papers. What? I didn't know if we were involved in a relationship, said Henry. Oh, yeah, I didn't know if we were involved in a relationship, said Henry. Well, what would you call it? Him. I don't know, I hadn't thought about it. I didn't know it needed a name. Well, we slept together 4 times, I said. Fine, okay, I have my answer. I headed for the door. What is that? Said Henry. This is just... So she is now speaking. She says, this is just a fuck, which is perfectly fine. I just wanted to know. Well, he said, I wouldn't call it that. Then what would you call it? It's a bit of fun. That's somewhere between just a fuck and a relationship. End of quote. The dialogue is about finding a name for the relationship located between and betwixt casual sex and a relationship in which the future is plausible. This relationship does not have a name because it is structured by the woman's uncertainty about the man's intentions and his emotions, the only elements which would help this woman orient herself in this interaction. The man himself does not know his own intention and is therefore unable to label the interaction. You simply don't know in which interaction you are. Sociologically, it's fascinating. The very multiplication of names of casual relationships that we have today, just to name a few, hookup, one-night stands, friends with benefits, etc., suggests the difficulty of naming and characterizing casual relationships, knowing what they're about, that is, knowing their aboutness, as phenomenologists would say, a relatively basic and taken for granted feature of all social interactions. Moreover, in the vignette above, casual sexuality not only creates confusion, but also lacks symmetry between the men and the women. This is what I call negative sociality, negative relationship. And so I will end now by trying to define negative sociality. And here I want to say that the kind of sociology I do is what I would call philosophical sociology. That is, it's a kind of sociology where you use empirical facts to clarify philosophical concepts, and you use philosophical concepts to clarify or make sense of empirical facts. And this is what my notion of negative relationship is about, exemplifying that type of sociology. My use of the term negative differs from the most common one in the philosophical tradition. For Adorno, negative thinking was a feature of what he called non-identity thinking, the kind of thinking that could help us grasp particulars and does not fall prey to abstract and instrumental rationality. My use of negative is also quite different from the one that has been popularized by Alexandre Kojève's interpretation of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. That is, and that became very famous and popular, especially with Lacan. It's Lacan who really popularized Kojève, actually. So, and what Kojève means by negativity, he means a subjectivity that is in quest of the recognition by another, recognition of another's desire, and yet that can never settle with the appropriation of the other's recognition or desire. In such meaning of negativity, if you want, is for me a positive moment of the self, in the sense that you want to get the desire of another. You are actually entering into a relationship with you project your desire on someone. You want the desire of somebody else's. So this is something that is actually generative of social bonds. It is generative of dialogue. It's something that really structures sociality. I call here negative bonds something else altogether, and give it a non-Hegelian meaning, one in which negative follows Durkheim's view of anomie, with one major difference or two, however, which is why I do not follow the Durkheimian terminology. Negative relationships emerge from hyper-connected modernity. So that's very different from anomie, because for Durkheim, anomie emerges when you're alone. Loneliness was a big factor for suicide for him. And I think this is completely different in modernity, and especially casual sex, where it is characterized by an incredible increase of connectedness and networks. And so for me, in negative relationship, the subject does not want relationship or is unable to form them because of, and I use again Durkheim's word, because of the indeterminate structure of his or her desire. In a negative bond, the self evades the mechanism of desire and of recognition, what Honneth calls recognition altogether. It is a bond in which there is no attempt to find, to know, to appropriate and conquer the subjectivity of another, which is the Hegelian meaning. In negative bonds, others are means for self-expression and for the assertion of one's autonomy, and not the object of recognition, not at all. Negative relationship also differs from anomie because it is, if you want to use a Foucauldian notion, it is socially extraordinarily productive. That is, it puts into motion a very wide economic sector and mental health sector of, like psychologists. Or just to say simply, if you want to go to a casual sex, you're going to go to a bar, you're going to dress up, you're going to buy your new lipstick and new underwear, and then you will, if it doesn't work out, you go to see a psychologist who will help you figure out what went wrong. So in other words, these kind of negative relationships are extraordinarily productive in Foucault's sense. They make the social bond work. They're not about the collapse of social bonds. They make it work constantly. Negative bonds then are negative in two meanings, which I take from the German phenomenological tradition and German phenomenology. One is that they point to the indeterminateness of my desire. I don't go into the details, but indeterminateness, which Durkheim uses, is actually also a notion that Sartre uses to speak about the indeterminateness of consciousness. You don't really know who you are, and you don't really know what you want. That's a Sartrean notion. And two, it comes also from Heidegger, they reveal that something is not quite working as it should. This is Heidegger's famous metaphor of the hammer. He says, when we hammer something, we don't notice what we are doing, but if the hammer breaks or the nail breaks and you can't hammer anymore, suddenly you pay attention to the hammer or to the nails. So for Heidegger, this is a very important notion because this is when the taken for grantedness, if you want, of everyday life is broken. So this is the second meaning of negative, because these are relationships that are not quite working properly as they should, even though you don't really know how they should. Negative relationships thus have fuzzy, unclear, undefined, and contested purposes. They have no scripted rules of engagement and disengagement. They carry no or little penalty for being undone. And negative bonds disappear quickly, not because they are contractually defined as transient, as for example the relationship with a bank teller or a customer, but because of their relative normlessness, their lack of scripted rules, and lack of shared frame of meaning. And as I said, the second meaning of a negative relationship is that we try to enter and we just don't know how to do it. It just doesn't work. So it should be clear to almost end that positive and negative here have no moral implications. These terms, for me, refer only to the ways in which social bonds are generated, whether by being clearly formulated in cultural scripts, such as being a teacher, a parent, or a husband, or by being relatively unscripted and normatively fuzzy, such as in casual sex or hookup culture. A negative social relationship is one that is driven by uncertainty, and social actors attempt to figure out the rules of interaction in them, while a positive relationship is relatively structured and organized around clear norms. The fuzziness of negative relationships means that normativity is not defined by a normative deviant binary opposition, but rather contains unclear and contested rules. I would thus venture the following hypothesis. In the realm of love and sexuality, we have moved from a modality of cultural action in which culture described the world thickly in symbols and moral narratives, prescribed and guided behaviors through hot meanings or well laid out plans of actions, to a modality of culture in which autonomy and freedom produce relatively weakly scripted fuzzy roles of interactions with unpredictable outcomes, that is, relatively normless interactions, at least in the private and intimate domains. By normlessness, I mean not only that behavior is improvised and that its rules are up for grabs, but also I mean the less playful meaning that the norms governing the conduct of sexual bonds are unclear. This lack of thick normativity derives from the very practice of freedom and is associated with a positive injunction that emerged from in particular consumer freedom, such as self-reliance, autonomy, hedonism, which have all become dominant lexicons of selfhood. These positive injunctions generate negative bonds that are normatively fuzzy and chaotic. This also entails, I think, and I will end with this, given that this is the beginning of a new center for the study of culture, I will end with a thought about culture. I think it should entail a rethinking of the notion of the function of culture itself. In traditional anthropology and sociology, culture shapes social bonds through roles, norms, rituals, and social scripts, that is, through positive injunctions to belong, identify, execute, and even improvise. In contrast, in negative relations, actors grapple with the elusiveness and meaning of their own actions. If culture is increasingly taking the form of advice or self-help culture, I think it is precisely because in the realms of love, parenting, and sexuality, few cultural schemas guide action in a binding way and compel men and women to align themselves around agreed upon rules and norms. Psychological self-management is nothing but the management of a very pervasive uncertainty in interpersonal relationships where sexual freedom and pleasure, both organized in the grammar and semantics of the consumer market, have been traded for psychological certainty. This, I think, characterizes what we may call the crisis of modern relationships. For Durkheim, crisis is an anomaly. It is something that deviates from a cohesive social group, which what social groups should be. I think here we may wonder if Durkheim can still help us think about and make sense of a sense of permanent crisis as it seems to be the case in contemporary liberal societies. Thank you.